Thanks a lot, Trevor. Thank you very much. Delighted to be with you, and it's wonderful to have the opportunity to talk about the economy with you again. I was listening to Trevor's very generous introduction. You know, after all those years, it would seem that I might have a clear answer to some simple questions, but instead of getting more clarity, I'm not sure. Maybe things get a little foggier as we learn to better appreciate the problems we're dealing with. By the way, if you're real good when you turn 80, you will win one of these. So you might have something to look forward to. I have as most people do, an annual checkup with my GP. I was in to see him the other day, and he says, "Bruce, you're doing real well. Most people your age are dead." And I thought, wow, what a bedside manner we have here. But it's wonderful to be with you. Your memory, probably you have other things. We are all rationally ignorant about most of what goes on in the world. I don't know that anyone would hazard a guess at saying what percentage of activity are we conscious of and aware of and keep up with. But it has to be less. It has to be less than 1% of what is going on. We are highly informed about things that are very important to us, to our work, to our families, to our well-being, and other things are just kind of out there on the radar. And so I doubt that anyone in here, unless you just have a hobby of looking at data, would remember what GDP growth was doing at this time a year ago. If you can remember that, we were seeing numbers like 4%, 4.2 in the third and fourth quarters last year, and then things really slowed down again. And we started bouncing along, and we began to see growth numbers of less than 1%, and then things bounced up again. But the thing that has happened in the last year, between the third quarter of the year before and now, partly relate to the incredible strength of the U.S. dollar. Europe has printed a lot of money, and if one group of people print money faster than you do, then your money gets strong relative to theirs, and you can buy far more of their goods, and they will buy less of yours. So our exports have gone down, our imports have gone up, and then expectations that interest rates will be raised here cause the dollar to be even stronger. Some people look at what is going on and they say there are three phases to the recovery from the 2008 collapse, credit collapse. In the first phase, it was the United States' turn, in a sense, to take an economic bath and to begin to recover from it. In the second phase, it was Europe. Theirs came later. And so we're coming out of the woods, Europe is going into the woods. The third phase, which is now, is one that focuses on what are called the emerging economies of the world. The emerging economies are those economies that are very sophisticated and market developed, but still lacking institutions to provide a strong framework for their economic activities. Included in those countries are China, India, Indonesia, Turkey, and Mexico, to give you an idea of what we're talking about. Now, when we look at the emerging economies, they are being hit by slowing China, which has reduced a remarkable appetite for commodities, all kinds of raw materials, many of which are the meat and bread of those emerging economies. And so if you look at data on prices of commodities, they all seem to be headed south. If you look at data on services, anything that requires human inputs, those prices seem to be headed north. And when we say those things, then we confront the challenge that the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee faces each time they meet. What's going to happen to inflation? What should we do with interest rates? And so in a sense, it's sort of like the story of the yellow brick road. You remember the story. The story is an incredible one. You know, there are these wonderful people walking down the yellow brick road, and look how happy they look right there. That is, they're on the yellow brick road. Hallelujah, we have escaped all kinds of hardships. And then, let's see if we can get this to move forward here. Then there's a question. Is there a miracle that could help us? Does anybody have some insight? Oh, if only we could have a wizard who could come and offer some guidance. And so as we talk today, we want to talk about how the economy is doing, sort of an update, and I've been doing that. But then want to address this question: can Eureka moments help? And what do we mean by a Eureka moment? A sudden flash of insight, of creativity, where someone says, hey, I've got an idea about a different way to do it, and it turns out to be an idea about a different way to do it, and you can say, Eureka, I have found it. Some psychologists call these aha moments. And I hope everybody in the room has had at least one. And some of the things we will talk about will give you some guidance as to how perhaps you might have more Eureka moments. Advice that you might be able to give to some other folks. And so there they are, riding down the yellow brick road, and then what do you know? The Wicked Witch of the West shows up. You remember the story. Right when they thought we're out of the woods and everything's going well, here comes the Wicked Witch of the West with her cackle, and she's saying, exports are declining. Oh. Canada's in a recession. The Fed can't make up its mind. So here the Wicked Witch, the political crazy season. Look at all these people who want to be presidents, and isn't it entertaining until you realize, hey, one of these people will be president. You know, and so it's crazy season. All kinds of crazy comments are being made, and the stock market is collapsing. And so the Wicked Witch of the West says, and finally, the second largest economy in the world is in slow gear. And so now, tell me about that yellow brick road. If only we had a wizard. Now, if you were to ask Janet Yellen, who is truly an outstanding economist and truly an outstanding manager of financial institutions, if you were to ask her if she is a wizard, well, let's let her answer. No. Janet Yellen said, don't put that hat on me. I'm no wizard. If you look at the forecasts and estimates that I have made, most of the time I'm wrong. Well, let's look at the forecasts that have been made by the Fed. There. What you're looking at here, if you stare at this a little bit, starting over in the upper left, that was a projection that the Fed made back in June of 2010 for GDP growth. Do you see? They were forecasting better than 3%, creeping on up to better than 4%. The dashed line is what happened. Now, if that won't make you humble, I don't know what would, but they say if you can't forecast well, you have to forecast often. And so the next line, which is kind of blue, you see, okay, let's just take where we are and forecast from there. And the blue line says, yellow brick road, here we come. We're going to be heading back up towards 3%. The dash line shows what happened. Oops, wrong again. And so then the aqua line, the somewhat orangish line, the somewhat reddish line, and the most recent forecast from the Fed, where finally, it seems, the forecasters are saying, well, let's just accept the inevitable slowing economy and say that's what we've got. And so there's the picture. And they're using words, not the Fed, but a lot of commentators are using words like secular stagnation. Secular stagnation is a term of art that emerged in Keynesian economics shortly after John Maynard Keynes wrote his general theory. His most dedicated disciple was a man named Alvin Hansen, who was at Harvard. And in a way, Hansen wrote more Keynesian economics than Keynes did. And it was Hansen who came up with this term of secular stagnation when an economy that has been rather vibrant just gets kind of bogged down for all kinds of reasons, and you have slow growth, which is one way of describing where we are right now. And by the way, that blue line isn't the latest Fed forecast, which we got 3 weeks ago. The new forecast lies below this one. And so we're not on the yellow brick road. The optimistic forecast is maybe 2.1, 2.2% real GDP growth. The Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank turns out an estimate, if you want to go to the website, called GDP Now. And GDP Now is a reading as of now, which they turn out every week, and they're reading about 1.5% for where we are now, largely because of the decline in exports and the slowing world economy that is affecting our economic activity. And so then, when you say, well, how's the U.S. economy doing? The answer from Dorothy is, I think we're on the yellow brick road, but I'm nervous. All of the measures of uncertainty. There's a measure of economic policy uncertainty that is generated daily and then weekly and monthly for the United States, for China, for other countries of the world. Those measures are going upward. By the way, the thing that usually makes it shoot highest for the U.S. economy is the risk of government shutdown. Every time there seems to be serious discussion of shutting down the government, or actually doing it, that index begins to shoot very, very vertical and heads north, and when that happens, it correlates highly with employment growth. When there is uncertainty about policy and you are running a business, the last thing you will do is to call your HR department and say, let's bring on another shift. Instead, you call the HR department and say, maybe we better wait a little bit until there is more certainty. So here's what the data look like. I'm showing you quarterly real GDP growth, those golden bars. The most recent one is the red bar there, 3.9. Doesn't that look good? First time in a long time we are over the yellow brick road, which is the long-term average of 3.17% growth. We've finally broken through it. And the white line there is a 4-quarter moving average, so that any point on it gives us an annual rate, and you can see if you look at it and stare at it a little bit, it's a little bit better than 2% on a 4-quarter moving average. But all of the bets say that that line isn't going to be going anywhere, and here's what to expect. On out to 2018. This is what some of the forecasters, when you put them all in a pot and stir them, you sort of get something that looks like this, with strong possibilities of a recession in 2019. And that recession, by the way, is not because it's in the mix and that we always have one about every 6 years, which is the case, but it is the expectation that by that time there will have been some inflation that gets the Fed really scared and they hit the brakes and we get a slowing economy along about 2018. But between now and then, nothing to write home about. Getting close to the yellow brick road, but never quite getting on it and staying there. And here's one of the reasons why. What you're looking at here has unemployment rates and labor market participation rates for the U.S. over 25 population based on educational attainment. And so this is employment based on educational attainment data. And over on the educational achievement, less than high school graduates, only 44%, 44.7 are participating in the economy. Now this is why we can't have much in the way of exciting production. Better than half of that population is sitting on the sideline, not even looking for employment and not employed. And you see what the unemployment rate is. That was in July of 2014. In 2015, guess what? It's gotten a little bit better. As your eyes go down the chart, you are seeing higher educational attainment, but it's not until you get to beyond high school that things begin to look healthy. And by the time you get to people who have a bachelor's degree or more, not only is it healthy, it's incredibly tight. a 2.6% unemployment rate. In other words, we have a crisis in this country in terms of employment for people who are highly qualified with educational credentials and experienced, because these are people over 25. And so it's those last two categories are sort of carrying the economy forward, and the lower two categories are still waiting for an opportunity maybe to get on the yellow brick road. Well, what are they waiting for? What might get them on the yellow brick road and get them going? Well, it will be construction. There are a lot of people who have less than a high school diploma or a high school diploma. There are a lot of people in that category who are highly skilled. They can pour concrete. They can hang drywall. They can frame houses. They can wire houses, heating and air conditioning, plumbing, stuff that probably most of us in this room cannot do. They are the ones that we call when the pipes get plugged up, when the lights no longer work. And so they are highly skilled, but it's going to be construction that'll get them going. And so what do we see? The red line here is housing permits. These are permits that are issued for new construction. And the blue line there are units that have actually started in the economy. And you can see that we are showing strength now. Those two lines follow each other rather closely. Permit data usually jumps 30 days ahead of construction data. And so you can say, hey, we're headed north. Things are looking pretty good. As we look a little more closely, we get this. What I've done here is to break down housing construction into two categories. The green line that you see is for single-family residences. I beg your pardon. For multifamily residences. All right. The red line is single family, and the blue line, put it together, add those two, and you get total. And so you see the excitement that we have in construction is coming from multifamily, not from single family. Now let your eyes go back beyond the white column, which marks the Great Recession, and look at the mountaintops where we were before the recession hit. And when you look at the mountaintops, you can understand why we are not starting a lot of single-family residences now. There was incredible overbuilding prior to the recession. And so there's a lot of inventory out there. It's beginning to be absorbed. Prices are beginning to rise. A lot of that has turned into rental property. A lot of people were buying up those vacant single-family homes, turning them into rental property. But then the green line is now getting excited. And part of that excitement, that spur that you see, is driven by people who are 18 to 34 years old, the so-called millennial generation. They have different traits and characteristics and interests as revealed by their behavior. They like cities. They're not ready to put a root down. They want to rent. They want a condo. And they want to walk to work in many cases. It'll be later before their demand turns to single-family residence. But now the reason we're talking about this is because it's this activity that will generate employment for the people with the lower educational attainment. There's the excitement that we're seeing in that marketplace. Now, if we're going to have real GDP growth, it can only come from two sources. One way of looking at it, a growing labor force working, doing the same thing, gives us more GDP. A growing labor force working, doing more, that's with higher productivity, will give us more GDP. Or the same labor force with higher productivity will give us more GDP. In other words, there are two things in the recipe. If you want to measure growth in GDP, there are two things: growth in employment and growth in productivity. And so what we're looking at here is the productivity side. And here you see the data for 2007 to 14. It looks kind of pale as compared to the three previous periods going back to 1979. And so, hey, if you've got weak productivity growth and you want to have high GDP growth, what have you got to have? Growing employment. Well, if you clamp down, for example, on illegal aliens and say we're going to be shipping them home, which we have, you're going to be shipping back labor force at a time when you've got well, if you say we're going to ship 11 million back, woo, at a time of declining productivity, then you would be saying what we want is really slow GDP growth, because there are only two things in the recipe. Well, let's look at employment growth. Up in the upper left-hand side, you see growth in working age population for the United States, the forecast that goes out to 2024, 0.4%. So we have very weak growth in the labor force, work-age people, coupled with low productivity, yields low GDP growth. Now we could stop for a moment and say, well, let's think for a minute about all of these wonderful people tragically trying to find peace and shelter and homes that are fleeing Syria. If you look at European countries, this kind of data, Germany, for example, has high productivity growth, no labor force. No labor force. They have a declining population. They are a disappearing population of people. They do not have a reproducing population because of the birth rate. Italy, even worse. And so when you look from country to country, you sometimes begin to get a little bit of a hint as to why some countries would be more welcoming of refugees than would be others. If we look at our own country, if this were the only thing that was on the table that one might be considering, you might say, hey, this is an opportunity to see stronger GDP growth by welcoming what some economists call the ultimate resource, human beings of work age. There's a lot more to the story, of course, but this last bar is the pale one in terms of real GDP growth. Now I want you to think about the second part of this. There's the population growth and there's productivity growth. What if we could have more aha moments? That's where productivity growth comes from. It comes from people with new ideas, innovations, some things patented, sometimes not. It's almost like magic. Perhaps you've had the experience of being a part of an organization that wasn't doing real well, it wasn't real exciting, and sometimes people really didn't look forward to coming to work. And you get a new boss, a new leader, who takes the same people, the same resources, and all of a sudden, there's excitement, productivity is going up. It's almost like magic. It's like metaphysics. And you say, well, what on earth? How do we explain this? And so, now, let's talk about that. Three-legged chickens, creativity and Eureka Moments. But let me stop for a moment and see if there's a question that's been raised in terms of the first discussion. We'll have time for more as we go. Well, if we're going to talk about three-legged chickens, you need to know, well, what do we mean by three-legged chickens? It so happens that there's a folky story that people who study humor consider to be one of the best funny stories. There are people who do research on all kinds of topics. Some people study what makes things funny. The three-legged chicken story goes like this. There's a fellow driving down a highway going about 50 miles an hour, and he looks over on the shoulder, and there's a chicken that's keeping up with him, running along the shoulder. So he speeds up to 60, the chicken speeds up. He goes on up to 70 and says, what the heck, I can outrun a chicken. The chicken stays abreast. And so finally, as he keeps moving, the chicken pulls ahead and takes a right turn, goes down a dirt road. The fellow says, I've just got to go and find out more about this, so he follows the chicken. The chicken turns into a driveway in front of a farmhouse and disappears, and There on the front porch is an old-timer. The fellow parks his car and goes up and says, "I beg your pardon, sir." The old-timer says, "I know why you're here. You want to know about those three-legged chickens." He says, "Three-legged chickens?" He says, "Yeah, that's why that chicken can run so fast. It has 3 legs." And he says, "Well, what's the story?" And the fellow says, "Well, me and my wife and my son all love drumsticks. And so we find that we've got to kill 2 chickens in order to get drumsticks, one for each of us." And I'd been thinking for years, I had some friends who were working over at the land-grant university, and I kept telling them, "You need to breed a chicken that will have 3 legs." And he said, lo and behold, they finally did it. And so I've got 3-legged chickens running all over the place. And the fellow who's curious says, "Well, tell me, how do they taste?" He says, "We don't know. We've never caught one." All right. Now, the 3-legged chicken story has in it all of the elements of the problem when we talk about creativity. All of the elements in a problem. First, there's recognition of a practical problem to be solved. 3 drumsticks. Then, eureka, an idea emerges. If only we could breed and get 3-legged chickens. Then there's experimentation by people closest to the problem, what economists call indigenous innovation. Innovation that takes place closest to the problem is usually what is generating our economic growth. You can say, well, we're going to fund all the great universities and that's where our innovation is going to come from. You can do that till the cows come home, but most of the innovations will come from somewhere else. Not solely. They will come from the workplace, from the place where people are actually engaged with problems. And then innovations then are usually disruptive and they have all kinds of problems. And so what we're trying to deal with here as we think about productivity growth is, for instance, this question: how do we get from fountain pens to ballpoint pens to transmission of thoughts from one mind to another? How do we get there? And what are the eureka moments that might do it? So let's talk about this puzzle and the magic, the metaphysics of it, and tell a few stories about what has happened. First, let's look at the magic that has taken place with the human population since 1300 in the Western world. And then what explains it? If we go back and study, and it has been studied, look at this. Output per worker in England did not increase at all for 300 years. From 1500 to 1800, there was absolutely no growth. Let your eyes go on down. Real wages in England were lower in 1800 than in 1200. That's productivity now. Lower. Not a 3-legged chicken in 600 years. That's what the world was like up until 1800. And so something happened. Edmund Phelps, Nobel laureate, is the leading light on studies of productivity and historical gains from production. And Phelps says, there are 4 countries that began to pull away: United Kingdom, France, Germany, and the United States. They began to pull away. Phelps' explanation as to why it happened is because of the emergence of markets with property rights and contracts, institutions that enabled people who were closest to problems to come up with solutions, maybe get a patent, maybe keep it a secret, and increase productivity where other countries failed to build those institutions. This is his story. Now, people who have looked at this, Ludwig von Mises, for example, says there are different kinds of minds, brains that are out there that explain this. If you want to have more productivity, then look inside the heads of people and let's see what we see. You perhaps know people who are really good at convergent thinking. They focus like a laser and they come in on a problem and they go down to a solution, and you probably know people who are divergent thinkers. They can't focus on the problem for thinking of something else. And you say, wait a minute, pay attention. You say, well, I can't. I was just thinking of another way to do this. It's the divergent thinkers that are bringing us innovations and aha moments and eureka. And Mises was talking about that. Stephen Johnson, and you'd be entertained when you read his book, How We Got to Now. Stephen Johnson is quite a prolific writer, wonderful writer, and Stephen Johnson has the idea of the adjacent possible. If you are a convergent thinker and you're really good at what you do and you stay focused on it, it's possible for you to have breakthroughs by going to an adjacent room, something close. For example, in economics, a number of years ago, there were a couple of scholars who decided that it would be fruitful to apply the logic of economics to political decision making. And so out of their leadership came a subfield in economics called public choice, which is huge. Focusing economics, the tools of economics, on politics. More recently, a group of economists have begun to focus on psychology. Let's take economic logic and apply it to psychological problems. That's an adjacent room. We're still doing economics. To be totally disruptive, you would invent a new field. And so this is what we're seeing here. People who are dedicated to the discipline will probably never have a truly astounding breakthrough, but they can have big breakthroughs in their field to increase productivity. And maybe you will see that in your office. John Maynard Keynes' warning on this topic was the main thing that holds us back is our inability to let go of the old ways of doing things. Inside corporations that are producing products, there are always individuals who say, I've got an idea about what we ought to do here at this company. I've been looking at how we put wheels on automobiles, and I think there's another way to do it. And quite often that individual is told by her supervisor, just keep your mind on what we are doing. We are the best in the world. The reason we are so good is because we do it better than anybody else. Don't bug us about changing. And quite often that person sometimes will say, well, I'm checking out of here. And there's a guy named Elon Musk who says, hey, I think I can produce automobiles better than General Motors. And people say, oh, you're out of your mind. No one individual could ever raise enough money to produce automobiles in California. Are you out of your mind? Electric? Come on. There's the divergent thinker. There's a kind of breakthrough. Here's a guy who's doing it when everybody says you're an idiot. You're a fool. Nobody can ever do that. That's the eureka moment that we're looking for. And Schumpeter looked at all this stuff and said, look, if we want to have output, greater happiness produced by economic engines, we've got to get innovation. In other words, we've got to get our productivity up. Well, are people creative because of being connected to other people's brains? You might say, well, it's a team effect. Matt Ridley, who is a zoologist, he was editor of The Economist magazine, a rather brilliant guy who's thought about lots of things, and he has this marvelous book that he has done on the rational optimist. And Ridley says, wait a minute, the key is not what's inside your head. The key is being able to tap into the heads of the entire human race. Woo. Well, that's big talk. Say, well, how on earth can you do that? You can do it by participating in markets. The markets connect people all over the world, and the products that come out of them, in a sense, are bringing forward things that you and I would never be able to make ourselves. And he illustrates this by something as simple as a number 3 pencil. That probably no single human being has enough knowledge in his or her head to make a number 3 pencil, to come up with the lacquer for the yellow cover, or to come up with the tin and the metallurgy for what holds the eraser, to be able to bring in the ingredients for the rubber that goes into the eraser, to be able to make the lead, to be able to bond the wood. No single individual could probably make anything just as simple as a pencil. Well, then you say, well, how on earth would we ever get an automobile? Or how on earth would we ever get pharmaceutical products that would be good for nervous disorders? Only by being connected. And then, of course, connectivity is being generated at such a pace now that we cannot even predict, let alone comprehend, what our world is going to be like. You're seeing the numbers right here. 3.6 billion people now connected in 2017, according to Cisco's data. How are they being connected? With smartphone technology that is 7 years old. A piece of technology, just 7 years old, is enabling almost 4 billion people to get on the same page. And so you can do something on your Facebook page, or you can send a tweet, and it's possible that 4 billion people will look at that page, or some large number of them. And so now the implications for productivity change are amazing, so that we can't even predict it. And there are things that are happening like the sharing economy. And in the sharing economy, and we see it all around us with Uber and so forth, but the one up at the top there in German, that says, welcome refugees. There was a website that was developed 3 weeks ago in Germany. Some people said, hey, we need to get a web page for people who want to provide space in their home for Syrian refugees. And so they went to IBM in Germany, and IBM said, hey, we'll help you develop your web page at no charge. And so almost overnight, they had a website. And in the first week, they had 3,000 hits, where someone who had space in a home and someone who wanted space in a home got connected. That's the world that we're talking about, and that's an innovation. Meanwhile, the rest of us are talking about, I don't know whether we ought to be taking refugees in or not. How on earth are you ever going to have? Well, it's just 3,000. That's the response that I got recently when I was giving a part of this lecture. And someone, hey, yeah, but we're talking about millions of people. We are. But each one is an individual. And this is what can happen in terms of innovative people who are developing Zipcar, Roadcar, Sidecar, Airbnb. Ordinary people who get an idea and say, hey, I think I can do something about it. A eureka moment. But, you know, it's possible getting connected, we just get real good at observing tragedies and taking pictures of them. And maybe that will be as far as it gets. It'll be the most photographed events in history, but nobody did anything other than get the photographs and get it recorded. When we think about productivity, then there's a school of thought that says maybe it just has to do with hard work. I mentioned the way minds might work that some people have talked about. And Malcolm Gladwell doesn't buy any of that. In his book Outliers, which you may have read, Gladwell has said there's no such thing as outliers. Those people you think of as being the finest concert violinists that ever lived, and they may be, they got that way because they worked harder, they practiced more consistently than anybody else. And so he says if you look at the behavior of people, the reason some people come up with these eureka moments is they don't ever rest. They're just working hard. And that's the explanation. Hard work. But then there's a whole field of neuroscience now that has exploded, and there's a question, well, is this something about the brain? Is it possible that people who are more productive, who have the eureka moments, who come up with the innovations, just have a different brain from the rest of us? And one of the leading scientist on this topic is a woman who is out at the University of Iowa, Nancy Anderson. And what Nancy did was to bring to her neuroscience laboratories there winners of Nobel Prizes, winners of Pulitzer Prizes, winners of other awards, what might be called outliers, and she hooked them up to the brain machines and read images of parts of their brains as they functioned and compared those to, let's say, the rest of us. And what she found was there are certain parts of the brains of people who are highly creative that function in a larger way than the base population. But out of her work, she now has a recipe that she can give, that she gives to you and me when we read her work which says, all right, if you want to be more creative, it may be that your brain in that particular location isn't larger than everybody else, but it's still possible for you to do something. And here's the slogan. Now, this is an acronym, you will never forget it. REST. If you're talking this to a relative who's in college having trouble with calculus or having trouble in physics and just can't seem to get the breakthrough, and she says, well, what do you think I should do? Say, get some rest. Random episodic silent thought is the key that we find from the work of neuroscientists now who are attempting to explain creative people. Random, that is, you can't say, well, I'll get up every morning at 6 o'clock and I'll do yoga and I'm going to clear my mind and then I'm going to wait for the inspiration. No, that won't work. It has to be random. All right? It has to be episodic. And it has to be silent. Oh, you mean I can't bring my smartphone with me? Ooh, it has to be silent. A few years ago, I was having a discussion with the CEO of the largest, or the only firm headquartered in South Carolina that is a New York Stock Exchange listed firm at the time. And we were having a conversation about phones, iPhones, smartphones, so on and so forth. And I said, tell me how your work as CEO has changed now that all of your staff and anybody in your company can call you up and you get a call. He says, well, there's a positive dimension to it. I find out about problems and opportunities faster than I would otherwise. But there's a big negative. Now, he didn't know anything about this, and I didn't either. I never have a silent moment. I've lost silence. And he says, you know, there are a lot of people who curse about traffic jams and how long it takes them to get into the city every morning. He said, I love them. That's when I get to think. Silence. But now that I've got a phone, I've lost it. Have you been to a filling station lately and while you're filling up your car, all of a sudden a loudspeaker comes on telling you about something that they want to sell you inside the store? Now, I haven't been in a ladies' restroom, but I've been in a lot of men's restroom, and some of the men maybe have had the experience of going to a urinal. And now you're getting advertisements. You can't even have silence in the restroom anymore. They're messages. We are being beamed all the time. And so, is there a cost to paying attention? Do we get so focused that we don't leave room for ideas that are down below the surface to come into our minds? And so what do creative people say? All right, Spencer Silver was a chemist, is a chemist, who developed what became the Post-it. Now, he didn't invent the Post-it, he invented the glue that was on the Post-it. The guy who came up with the Post-it, he was singing in the choir at church, looking for a way to put little pieces of paper marking the pages in his hymn book so that he could find them easily and not damage the hymn book. That was a Eureka moment. The Eureka moment came back to work the next day. And there we got the Post-it. Now, there are a lot of reasons to go to church. There are lots of good reasons that you might want to go to church or to a synagogue or to a mosque. One reason you might want to go is because for many people there are times when you have silence. Maybe not total silence, but silence with respect to the rabble that is normally outside or invading your work environment, so that creative moments might creep in. Hermann von Helmholtz made massive breakthroughs in both chemistry, thermodynamics, the study of time. And here's what he said. Sort of the same thing. In fact, one of his great breakthroughs came to him in a dream, and he jumped out of bed, wrote down very quickly what he had dreamt about a solution to a problem. The next morning he got up and he could not read his handwriting. The next night he had the same dream. I think that is really rare. And this time he printed more carefully. But as you see here, as he talks about the creative process, it comes after having turned the problem over in all kinds of dimensions in a sense, preparation. I was down at the Big House. The Big House is where the Allman Brothers lived in Macon, Georgia. If any of you are Southern rock fans, then you know about the Allman Brothers. I was down visiting the Big House last Thanksgiving. They opened up for me and my family. We always have a family reunion at Thanksgiving, and so I contacted the operators of the Big House and I said, would you open up just for my family? And they did. And so we had a tour of the Big House. If you like Southern rock and the Allman Brothers, you might like to visit the Big House. Well, when I went to Dickie Bett's room, this was on the wall. And so I took a picture of it. And Dickie Betts there is telling you how he happened to come up with the words and the music for Jessica, which is named for his daughter. Or maybe even better to some people's ways of thinking, Rambling Man. What a song. And look at it. It took 20 minutes to do Rambling Man. In a moment of silence, random, episodic, silent. And Ron Rash, who is now quite a popular novelist, he keeps turning them out, short story writer and novelist. Ron Rash in the Wall Street Journal interview was asked, where do you get your ideas? And he said, I don't know. And then he goes on to say, if there were a place where I could go, I would not go there. I would not go to the idea room and get a bunch of ideas for a novel. It just has to happen. And Taylor Swift, look at this. She doesn't know where these songs come from. They just seem to float down in front of me, sometimes in an airport bathroom, sometimes in a mall or on a tour bus. Rest, random, episodic, silent thought. But surely it's not the first time she's tried to sing. No. In other words, it's saying, give your mind a chance to talk to you. Vernon Smith got the Nobel Prize in economics. I was with Vernon. He was on the Clemson campus Tuesday, giving a lecture. And I asked Vernon about this very story because Ted Bergstrom had written this. It was published in an economic journal titled Vernon Smith's Insomnia and the Dawn of Experimental Economics. Vernon Smith, who's now at Chapman University out in California, is credited with inventing experimental economics. Getting people engaged in actual experiments, doing economics, and then drawing inferences from their behavior. And here's Vernon's story. He could not sleep. Here he's got insomnia. And he's just lying there, trying to think about a way to test an idea about how markets work. And it was a result of that insomnia, what we would call rest, that gave him his breakthrough. And two guys who've just turned out a book, The Eureka Factor, these are neuroscientists, are telling us the same thing. In other words, as I scan this field and look at the science coming out of psychology and neuroscience, it appears that we are getting something that offers guidance as to what explains the prevalence of Eureka moments. But why are we having this conversation? Why are we talking about Eureka moments? Why did I even raise this? Why bring in three-legged chickens into this room when you've got wonderful sandwiches back there? What was the point? Do you remember what started the conversation? A concern about productivity in America. A concern about productivity is a concern about creativity. And so then we can stir that pot a little bit. Is the fact that we have such low productivity, is that saying we are not as creative as people anymore? I don't think so. I don't think that's what it's saying. It may be saying something about where our creativity gets focused. What are some of our most creative people focusing on? Are they focused on problem solving in the production of services and products for consumers? Or are they focused on other things? Now, as you know, I've talked with you a good bit about regulation over the years and shown you a good bit of data on regulation. That's sort of my hobby. And I've also talked with you about bootleggers and Baptists and theories of regulation. let me just put it in this one little kernel, because I leave it in a sense as the question, or is it the problem, is the question. Is this the problem? When the rate of return to creative people is higher in modifying regulations or in blocking competition through efforts, if it's higher there than something that might take place in the laboratory or on the shop floor, then incentives would say your brightest and best people at the margin will begin to focus on those other things. When we look at the growth of regulation and try to explain it, all of that growth is associated with human beings doing things, and in some cases, some of the most creative.